Here are 3 highly detailed, half-body portrait prompts in US English to generate consistent images of Hermione Black throughout different stages of the story. Portrait 1. The Boston Prodigy, Pre-Academy. Prompt: a medium close-up, half-body portrait of an 11-year-old girl named Hermione, facing directly into the camera with a fiercely intelligent and calculating expression. She has intense dark brown eyes, thick wavy dark brown hair, and pale skin. She is wearing a neat white collared shirt under a charcoal gray sweater. The background is a cozy but dimly lit Boston brownstone study filled with towering mahogany bookshelves, scattered ancient tomes, and floating dust motes illuminated by warm, golden hour sunlight streaming through a window. Cinematic lighting, photorealistic, 8K resolution, dark academia aesthetic. Portrait 2. The Heiress of Black at the Academy. Prompt: a medium close-up, half-body portrait of an 11-year-old girl named Hermione, looking directly at the camera with a cold, authoritative, and unshakable expression. She has intense dark brown eyes, thick wavy dark brown hair, and pale skin. She is wearing immaculate, dark magical academy robes with a subtle silver trim. She rests one hand casually near her chest, clearly displaying a heavy silver ring with a square black obsidian stone on her right index finger. The background is a subterranean, Gothic magical library with ancient stone arches, floating glowing blue candles, and shadowy shelves. Dramatic fantasy lighting, hyperrealistic, 8K. Portrait 3. The Chess Master, the Winter Gala. Prompt: a medium close-up, half-body portrait of an 11-year-old girl named Hermione, making direct eye contact with the camera while wearing a sharp, triumphant, and slightly predatory smile. She has intense dark brown eyes, thick wavy dark brown hair, and pale skin. She is dressed in custom-tailored, formal dress robes of midnight black silk trimmed with silver thread. The background is an opulent magical winter gala inside a massive stone castle, featuring beautiful out-of-focus floating ice sculptures, gently falling enchanted snow, and the glow of warm chandeliers. High-fashion dark fantasy, epic cinematic lighting, intricately detailed, 8K resolution. The Granger residence, a stately, ivy-draped brownstone nestled in the affluent heart of Beacon Hill, Boston, was a monument to quiet intellectualism. Inside, the walls were lined from floor to ceiling with oak bookshelves, sagging under the weight of medical journals, historical biographies, and classic literature. To the outside world, Richard and Jean Granger were respected, highly successful orthodontists with a penchant for classical music and Sunday crosswords. To 11-year-old Hermione Granger, they were simply the center of a very logical, very ordered universe. Hermione was not like the other children on her street, nor was she like the children at her exclusive private elementary school. She possessed a mind that operated like a steel trap, absorbing facts, figures, and languages with a voracious, almost terrifying speed. By the time she was 8, she had exhausted the local library's children's section. By 10, she was debating her father on the ethical nuances of historical conflicts. Her parents looked upon her with a mixture of overwhelming pride and a strange, lingering overprotectiveness that bordered on paranoia. They rarely let her out of their sight, curating a safe, predictable bubble around her. But there was always something buzzing beneath the surface of Hermione's skin, a static electricity that snapped when she was angry, a strange kinetic force that made books tumble from high shelves directly into her waiting hands. She had rationalized these occurrences as sheer coincidence or anomalies in physics. She was a girl of science, after all. Until the second Tuesday of July. The morning was thick with New England humidity. Hermione sat at the mahogany dining table, methodically buttering a piece of toast while parsing through a dense volume of European history. A sudden, sharp tapping at the bay window broke the silence. Hermione looked up. A massive, golden-eyed great horned owl was perched on the sill, a thick parchment envelope clamped firmly in its beak. She did not scream. She did not panic. She simply put down her butter knife, walked to the window, and unlatched it. The owl stepped inside, dropped the heavy envelope onto the table, and took flight back into the sweltering Boston sky. Hermione approached the letter. The parchment was thick, smelling faintly of ozone and old dust. The ink was emerald green, the calligraphy flawless. Miss Hermione Granger, the second-floor bedroom at the front 14, Lewisburg Square, Boston, Massachusetts. She flipped it over. A heavy wax seal bound the envelope, bearing a crest, an eagle, a winged horse, a horned serpent, and a puma-like creature. Richard and Jean entered the dining room, holding coffee mugs, mid-conversation about a dental conference. They froze. Their eyes locked onto the parchment. "It's an acceptance letter," Hermione said, her voice eerily calm as she broke the seal and scanned the contents. "To a place called the East Coast Magical Academy. It claims I am a witch. It claims magic is real." She expected her parents to laugh, to call the police, to declare it an elaborate prank. Instead, Richard Granger's face drained of color. Jean dropped her mug, the porcelain shattering against the hardwood floor, dark coffee seeping into the rug. "We knew," Jean whispered, her voice trembling, tears instantly springing to her eyes. "Oh, Richard, it's finally happening. She's a Muggle-born. It's a miracle." Hermione's brow furrowed. The logical foundation of her world was cracking, but her mind was already building a new framework. Magic existed. She was a witch. And apparently, her parents had been waiting for this day. She carefully folded the letter, a spark of unprecedented ambition igniting in her chest. She was going to be the best witch this academy had ever seen. To access the magical world on the East Coast, one did not go to New York or Washington, D.C. One went to Salem, Massachusetts. Beneath the veneer of tacky tourist traps and fake witch museums lay a concealed, cobblestone alleyway known as the Crucible, the oldest magical commercial district in North America. 3 weeks after the letter arrived, the Granger family walked through the brick illusion behind a popular coffee shop and stepped into a world of sensory overload. Robed figures bustled past, cauldrons bubbled in shop windows, and the air smelled heavily of roasted chestnuts, dragon-hide leather, and ozone. Hermione was in her element. She had already purchased her wand, a firm, 10 3/4-inch vine wood with a dragon heartstring core, from a dusty, intimidating wand maker who noted she had the spark of ancient fire in her eyes. She had practically bought out the bookstore, carrying a featherlight enchanted trunk filled with volumes far beyond the required first-year reading list. "Just one more stop, dear," Jean said, her hand resting protectively on Hermione's shoulder. "The list mentions an antique magical focus for history of magic." They entered a dim, cluttered shop named Borgin and Burke's Antiquities, Salem branch. The air inside was heavy, oppressive, and smelled of polished silver and old blood. While her parents spoke to the hunched, quiet proprietor at the front, Hermione wandered down an aisle of cursed jewelry, unblinking glass eyes, and tarnished chalices. Something pulled at her. It wasn't a physical tug, but a magnetic resonance in her chest. It felt like a heartbeat syncing with her own. She stopped in front of a velvet-lined glass case. Inside, resting on a bed of black silk, was a heavy silver locket. It was unpolished, tarnished with age, but the crest on the front was unmistakable, a shield flanked by greyhounds, adorned with stars, and a skeletal hand holding a wand. Without thinking, Hermione reached out. The glass of the display case seemed to melt away beneath her fingertips, yielding to her magical signature. Her small fingers closed around the cold silver. The moment her skin made contact, a violent shockwave of raw, indigo magic exploded from the locket. It wasn't a physical blast, but a psychic detonation. From the front of the store, Richard and Jean Granger screamed. Hermione spun around, dropping the locket back onto the velvet. Her parents had collapsed to their knees on the dusty floorboards. Richard was clutching his head, his eyes squeezed shut in absolute agony, while Jean was sobbing hysterically, gasping for air as if she were drowning.
"Mom."
"Dad," Hermione yelled, sprinting toward them. The proprietor was cowering behind his counter, wand drawn, eyes wide with terror. "The charm?" Richard gasped, his voice tearing at his throat. He looked at Hermione, but his eyes were no longer looking at his beloved, brilliant daughter. He was looking at a stranger. Jean, what have we done? Who is she? The memories. Jean wailed, clutching her chest, rocking back and forth. They're breaking. Oh God, the blood. The green light. The man in the shadows. Hermione stood frozen, the heavy, ancient magic of the locket still thrumming in her veins. The world as she knew it had not just cracked, it had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The people crying on the floor were the only parents she had ever known, yet as they looked at her with a mixture of terror and awakening horror, she realized a fundamental, chilling truth. Her entire life was a lie. The ride back to Beacon Hill was suffocatingly silent. The Grangers did not touch her. They looked at her with a heartbreaking concoction of profound love and deep, unshakable fear. Once back in the safety of the brownstone, Richard poured himself a heavy glass of scotch, something he never did before sunset, while Jean sat at the dining table, staring blankly at the wall. Hermione stood at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her face an unreadable mask. "Explain," she demanded. It was not the voice of an 11-year-old girl. It was the voice of a judge holding court. Richard took a shaking breath, the amber liquid sloshing in his glass. "You aren't ours, Hermione. I mean, you are. We love you. We raised you. You are our daughter in every way that matters. But by blood." Jean finally spoke, her voice a hollow whisper. 11 years ago, a woman appeared in our living room. It was the middle of the night. It was raining. She was bleeding, holding a bundle of blankets. She had a wand. Jean squeezed her eyes shut. She said her name was Andromeda. She said the child she carried was being hunted by the most dangerous people in the world. She told us we had been selected because we were good, decent, non-magical people with no ties to their world. She cast a spell, Richard continued, his voice breaking. A memory charm. Obliviate. But it was complex. It didn't erase you. It wove you into our history. It fabricated memories of a pregnancy, of a hospital birth, of your first steps. It made us believe you were a Muggle-born anomaly. Hermione's mind worked furiously, categorizing the data, analyzing the variables, keeping her emotions locked in a tightly sealed box deep in her mind. "If I am being hunted," she said coldly, "then who am I running from? And more importantly, who am I?" Richard pulled a folded piece of parchment from his wallet, something that, until an hour ago, he had believed was a receipt. He slid it across the table. Hermione unfolded it. It was a birth record, written in that same emerald magical ink. Name: Hermione Jean Black. Father: Sirius Black. Mother: classified by order of the DMLE. Status: pureblood. Hermione stared at the name. Black. It felt heavy. It felt like a promise. Who is Sirius Black? Jean choked out a sob. When the memories came back, the knowledge that Andromeda planted in our minds unlocked too. Sirius Black, he is your father. And he is rotting in a maximum security magical prison off the coast of Maine. For what crime? Murder, Richard said grimly. Treason. They said he betrayed his best friends and slaughtered innocent people. But Andromeda told us before she cast the spell, it was a lie. He was framed. A setup orchestrated by a powerful cabal of pureblood supremacists in New York. The man who orchestrated his downfall, the man who paid off the judges and forged the evidence. "Give me a name," Hermione commanded, her brown eyes flashing with a dangerous, dark light. "Lucius Malfoy," Richard whispered. Hermione closed her eyes. The name echoed in her mind, embedding itself into her very soul. She did not cry for the parents who weren't hers. She did not cry for the father she had never met, currently imprisoned in a lightless cell for crimes he did not commit. Crying was an inefficient use of energy. Anger, however, was fuel. Over the next 48 hours, the atmosphere in the brownstone shifted from a cozy family home to a war room. The Grangers hovered on the periphery, unsure of how to interact with the terrifyingly composed stranger that their daughter had become. Hermione had commandeered her father's study. The walls, once adorned with dental degrees, were now covered in massive sheets of parchment. She had owl-ordered a dozen new books from Salem, paying with the allowance she had meticulously saved for years. The titles on her desk were not on the first-year syllabus. The Magical Code of the United States, Pureblood Genealogy of North America and Europe, Blood Rights and Magical Heirship, and The Corruptions of the Wisengamot. She barely slept. She consumed knowledge with a predatory hunger. She read about the most ancient and noble House of Black. They were not just a family, they were an institution. They were royalty. Feared, respected, and steeped in dark magic, they held seats of power across the globe. She learned that she was not a mudblood, the derogatory term she had read about in a history book just yesterday. She was the absolute apex of the blood hierarchy. She read about the Malfoys. Wealthy, influential, untouchable. Lucius Malfoy sat on the board of governors for the East Coast Magical Academy and held immense sway over the Magical Congress of the United States of America, MACUSA. He was the man who had pulled the strings to bury her father alive in a stone cell. Hermione stood before her makeshift evidence board, a red quill in hand. She drew a line connecting a sketched portrait of Lucius Malfoy to the name Sirius Black. Her initial plan for school had been simple: study hard, get top marks, and prove that a Muggle-born could outshine anyone. Perhaps she would have championed the rights of the oppressed. Perhaps she would have started a club for house elves or advocated for magical equality. That girl died in the antique shop in Salem. The new Hermione had zero interest in activism. Equality was a noble concept for peacetime. She was going to war. If Lucius Malfoy believed in the absolute supremacy of pureblood power, then she would use that very system to tear his life apart. She would not fight him as an outsider. She would fight him from the inside, wielding the very laws and prejudices he helped construct. She would be smarter, sharper, and more ruthlessly brilliant than anyone in his circle. She would humiliate his heir, dismantle his political network, and find the legal loopholes to drag him into the light. Hermione? Jean knocked softly on the study door. "Dinner is ready, sweetheart." Hermione turned, her expression softening just a fraction for the woman who had cared for her. "I'll be down in a minute, Mom." Jean smiled, relieved that the title was still intact, and closed the door. Hermione looked back at the board. She needed resources. She needed immunity. And according to blood rights and magical heirship, the daughter of an imprisoned lord of an ancient house was entitled to claim the family's assets, provided she had the blood, the magical strength, and the sheer audacity to demand it. She packed a small leather satchel with her legal books, her wand, and a change of clothes. She was going to New York. Wall Street, New York City, was a canyon of steel and glass, a monument to Muggle capitalism. But tucked between two towering financial institutions stood a building made of slanted, stark white marble that Muggles simply walked past, their eyes sliding right off its facade. Gringotts Wizarding Bank, North American headquarters. Hermione stepped through the massive bronze doors alone. She had taken the train from Boston, leaving her parents a note that she would return by nightfall. The interior of the bank was vast, echoing with the clinking of coins and the scratching of quills. Goblins, dressed in impeccable pinstripe suits, sat at towering mahogany counters, sneering down at the wizards and witches below. Hermione did not approach a teller. She walked directly to the center desk, the highest and most imposing in the room, reserved for the head goblin of the branch. A scarred, ancient goblin peered down at her over half-moon spectacles. "Are you lost, child? The exchange counter for Muggle pocket money is to the left." Hermione met his gaze, her posture perfectly straight, her eyes cold. "I am not here to exchange pocket money. I am here to demand a blood heritage test and invoke the right of succession under the Treaty of 1709. The goblin paused, his quill hovering over a ledger. He looked at the 11-year-old girl in Muggle clothing with a newfound, sharp interest. "That is an archaic request, and a painful one. It requires a fee of 50 galleons, non-refundable, regardless of the result. Bill it to the vault you are about to unlock," Hermione replied evenly. The goblin's lips curled into a terrifying, jagged smile. "Follow me." He led her through a labyrinth of marble corridors into a private, dimly lit ritual room. In the center sat a stone altar basin. The goblin, who introduced himself as Ragnarok, produced a silver dagger etched with runic symbols and a roll of blank, golden parchment. 7 drops of blood in the basin, Ragnarok instructed, handing her the dagger. No healing charms until the parchment is fully inscribed. Hermione did not hesitate. She took the blade, pressed the sharp edge to her palm, and dragged it across her skin. The sting was sharp, but she didn't flinch. She held her hand over the basin, counting the drops as they hit the stone.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
The moment the 7th drop landed, the blood flared with a brilliant, blinding silver light. It slithered up the sides of the basin and leaped onto the golden parchment, soaking into the fibers. The blood shifted from crimson to a deep, shimmering black ink, forming elegant, looping cursive. Ragnarok leaned forward, reading the text as it materialized. His breath caught in his throat. He looked from the parchment to Hermione. The sneer entirely vanished from his face, replaced by a look of profound, wary respect. "Well?" Hermione asked, wrapping a handkerchief tightly around her bleeding palm. Ragnarok bowed, a deep, formal bend at the waist. "It is an honor to serve you, Sirius Black." He turned the parchment toward her. Name: Hermione Jean Black. Title: Heiress presumptive of the most ancient and noble house of Black. Vaults claimed: the Black Primary Reserve, London; the North American Black Annex, New York; the Orion Trust. Status: emancipated by magical right of the unjustly incarcerated Lord. As the daughter of Lord Sirius Black, who is unable to fulfill his duties, and as the last magically recognized heir of the bloodline, you claim full proxy over the House of Black, Ragnarok explained, his voice hushed. This grants you unrestricted access to the family fortunes, properties, and, most importantly, political immunity from underage magic restrictions and certain ministry decrees. Ragnarok clapped his hands, and another goblin scuttled into the room carrying a velvet box. Ragnarok opened it, revealing a massive, heavy ring. It was forged of twisted silver, set with a square-cut, flawless obsidian stone bearing the Black family crest. "The heir ring," Ragnarok said softly. "It will resize to fit your finger. Be warned, Sirius Black. The magic of your ancestors is heavy. It will reject those who are unworthy." Hermione reached into the box. She did not feel fear. She felt destiny. She slid the heavy ring onto her right index finger. The obsidian pulsed. A rush of cold, ancient, and undeniably dark magic surged up her arm, sinking into her bones. It tasted like ozone and absolute authority. The ring shrank, locking perfectly onto her finger like a second skin. She looked at her hand, at the dark stone gleaming in the dim light. She was no longer just Hermione Granger, the bookworm from Boston. She was Hermione Jean Black, and she possessed the wealth, the power, and the terrifying intellect to bring the pure-blood elite to their knees. "Thank you, Ragnarok," Hermione said, turning to leave. "Sirius Black," the goblin called out, a wicked gleam in his eye. "What are your first orders for the estate?" Hermione paused at the doorway, a cold, predatory smile finally gracing her lips. "I want a full financial audit of the Board of Governors at the East Coast Magical Academy. Specifically, I want to know exactly who Lucius Malfoy is paying off. Prepare the ledgers. I have a school year to plan." With the heavy oak doors closing behind her, Hermione stepped back out into the sweltering New York afternoon. The war had officially begun. Grand Central Terminal was a cathedral of Muggle industry, echoing with the frantic footsteps of thousands of New Yorkers rushing to their mundane destinations. Hermione moved through the sea of briefcases and trench coats with eerie precision. She pushed a brass trolley laden with a single, black leather trunk. She wore a tailored, charcoal gray wool coat, a crisp white collar peeking out from beneath it. There was no trace of the nervous, wide-eyed 11-year-old she had been a month ago. Between tracks 41 and 42 lay a solid limestone pillar. Without breaking her stride, Hermione walked directly into the stone. The cold shock of magical transit washed over her, and she emerged onto a hidden platform veiled in billowing white steam. Above her, a massive iron clock face read, "The Atlantic Express, nonstop to the East Coast Magical Academy." The train itself was a sleek, midnight blue locomotive, thrumming with arcane energy rather than coal. The platform was a chaotic tapestry of magical elite. Parents in sweeping silk cloaks bid farewell to their children, owls hooted from brass cages, trunks floated through the air guided by casual flicks of wands. Hermione noticed the subtle hierarchies immediately. The wealthiest families stood closest to the first-class carriages, their noses upturned, casting disdainful glances at the families lingering near the rear. Hermione bypassed them all. She boarded the train and claimed a private compartment near the center, sliding the heavy mahogany door shut and drawing the velvet curtains. She had no interest in making friends. Friends were a liability, allies were a necessity, and she was not yet ready to recruit. She opened her trunk and extracted a massive, leather-bound tome titled The Wisengamot Precedents of 1892, Loopholes and Blood Rights. Settling into the plush leather seat, she began to read, a silver quill spinning absent-mindedly between her fingers. About 20 minutes into the journey, the compartment door slid open. 3 boys stood in the corridor. The one in the center had striking, pale blonde hair, a sharp aristocratic face, and robes that cost more than most Muggle cars. Hermione recognized him instantly from the society pages she had memorized. Draco Malfoy, heir to the Malfoy Empire. The son of the man who had destroyed her father. Hermione's heart beat a fraction faster, but her face remained carved from ice. She did not look up from her book. "Every compartment is full," Draco drawled, his voice dripping with an unearned superiority. He glanced at her plain, uncrested trunk and the simple elegance of her Muggle-style coat. He sneered. "Who let you on this end of the train? The Muggle-born carriages are at the back. Go find a seat with your own kind." Hermione slowly turned a page of her book. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The 2 boys flanking Draco shifted uncomfortably, but Draco's pale cheeks flushed with anger at being ignored. "Did you hear me, mudblood?" Draco snapped, stepping into the compartment and drawing his wand. "I told you to get out." Hermione finally lifted her eyes. They were a deep, fathomless brown, completely devoid of fear. She closed her book with a sharp snap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet space. "Your pronunciation of the incantation you are currently considering is sloppy, Malfoy," Hermione said, her voice a low, terrifying purr. "And your grip on your wand is far too rigid. If you attempt to cast a hex in this confined space, the backlash will likely shatter your wrist. Now, I suggest you close the door from the outside, before I decide to report you to the conductor for disturbing my peace." Draco blinked, thrown entirely off balance. No Muggle-born had ever spoken to him with such chilling authority. "How do you know my name?" he demanded, trying to regain his footing. "I make it a point to know the names of small, insignificant obstacles," Hermione replied smoothly. She picked up her book again, dismissing him entirely. "Close the door, Draco. You're letting a draft in." Infuriated, confused, and strangely intimidated, Draco stood frozen for a second longer before one of his lackeys tugged on his sleeve. He scoffed loudly, attempting to save face, and slammed the compartment door shut. Alone again, Hermione allowed a slow, razor-sharp smile to curve her lips. He was exactly as arrogant and as foolish as she had hoped. The East Coast Magical Academy was a fortress of dark Gothic stone nestled deep within the magically concealed peaks of the Berkshire Mountains in Massachusetts. It was a sprawling, ancient castle, its spires piercing the low-hanging clouds. The first-year students were herded into the grand hall for the sorting ceremony. The ceiling was enchanted to mirror the raging thunderstorm outside, flashes of lightning illuminating the hundreds of floating candles. 4 long oaken tables stretched across the room, filled with older students draped in the robes of their respective houses. At the front of the hall stood the headmaster, an imposing wizard with a stern face, standing beside a massive, glowing golden scale, the astrometric orrery. When a student touched the scale, It would measure the weight of their magical core, their ambition, their courage, and their intellect, assigning them to their rightful house.
The roll call began.
Draco Malfoy was called early. He stepped up, a smug smile plastered on his face. The moment he touched the scale, it tipped violently toward the symbol of the horned serpent, the house of scholars, ambition, and the fiercely cunning. The serpent table erupted into applause, and Draco took his seat, looking exactly like a king claiming his throne. Hermione waited, observing the faculty table. Her eyes scanned the professors until they landed on a tall man with a pinched face and slicked back hair, Professor Corvus Knott, the potions master and a known associate of Lucius Malfoy. Granger, Hermione, the deputy headmistress called out, her voice echoing through the silent hall. Whispers broke out immediately. Granger. A thoroughly Muggle name. Draco Malfoy leaned across the horned serpent table, a cruel smirk on his face. Watch this, Draco whispered loudly to his sycophants. Let's see where they put the mudblood. Probably out in the stables. Hermione stepped out of the line. She walked with a measured, deliberate grace, her chin held high. The great hall fell completely silent, the sheer force of her presence demanding their attention. She did not look at the deputy headmistress. She did not look at the golden scale. She stopped directly in front of the center aisle and turned slowly, her eyes locking onto Draco Malfoy. My name, Hermione said, her voice magically amplified just enough to carry to the rafters, is not Granger. The murmurs died instantly. The professors at the high table leaned forward. For 11 years, I was hidden in the Muggle world for my own protection, Hermione continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling on Professor Knott, who had suddenly gone remarkably pale. Protected from the cowards who orchestrated the framing and illegal imprisonment of my father. Draco stood up, unable to contain his anger at her audacity. What are you rambling about, Mudblood? Stop stalling and touch the scale. Hermione slowly raised her right hand. The great hall's candlelight caught the flawless, dark obsidian of the heavy silver ring on her index finger. The moment the ring was exposed to the ancient magic of the school, it reacted. A shockwave of pure, suffocating magical pressure pulsed outward. The floating candles flickered violently, turning from warm gold to a deep, icy blue. The air grew instantly freezing. I demand you address me by my proper title, Heir Malfoy, Hermione commanded, her voice dropping into a register of absolute authority that forced several students to physically shrink back. I am Hermione Jean Black, heiress presumptive of the most ancient and noble house of Black, and my blood outranks yours in every registry in this country. A pin drop could have been heard in the ensuing silence. Draco Malfoy's face drained of all color. He fell back into his seat as if he had been physically struck, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The House of Black was royalty. They were the apex predators of the pureblood hierarchy, a family so steeped in dark, ancient power that even the Malfoys bowed to them. And Sirius Black's daughter was standing right in front of him. At the faculty table, Professor Knott knocked over his goblet, the red wine spilling like blood across the white tablecloth. Without waiting for permission, Hermione turned and placed her hand on the golden scale of the astrometric orrery. It didn't just tip, it slammed downward with explosive force, locking instantly onto the horned serpent. Hermione removed her hand, smoothed her robes, and walked toward the horned serpent table. The students parted for her like the Red Sea. She took a seat directly across from a paralyzed Draco Malfoy. Pass the potatoes, please, Hermione said softly, pouring herself a goblet of water. The war had moved to the front lines. The foundational doctrine of Draco Malfoy's entire existence was remarkably simple. Pure blood equated to superior magical power, superior intellect, and a divine right to rule. Muggle-borns were considered intellectually stunted, capable only of crude mimicry, while the ancient families possessed a refined, inherent genius. Hermione Black took that doctrine, set it on fire, and forced Draco to choke on the ashes. It began in their first week of classes. In Charms, Professor Flitwick's American counterpart, A diminutive wizard named Professor Vance instructed the first years on the intricate wand movements required for the levitation charm. Draco, desperate to reassert his dominance after the humiliation in the Great Hall, spent 10 minutes aggressively swishing and flicking his wand at his feather, managing only to make it twitch. "Like this, Mr. Malfoy," Hermione said from the desk beside him. She didn't look at him. She didn't even draw her wand. She simply stared at the feather, gave a microscopic flick of her wrist, and the feather shot into the air, hovering perfectly motionless exactly 2 feet above the desk. Nonverbal, wandless magic in her first week. Professor Vance nearly fainted. Draco stared at the feather, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. In Transfiguration, while the rest of the class struggled to turn matchsticks into needles, Hermione transfigured her matchstick into a solid silver sewing needle, etched with microscopic runes, and then silently transfigured it back again just to prove a point. But it was potions that truly broke Draco's spirit. Professor Corvus not ruled the dungeon classroom with cruelty and favoritism. He had intended to make an example of the newly revealed Black Heiress, perhaps to report back to Lucius Malfoy that the girl was a fraud or an incompetent fool. He assigned them the draft of forgetfulness, a notoriously volatile brew for first years. Draco worked meticulously, eager to impress not. His potion simmered a passable cloudy blue. Hermione, however, worked with terrifying efficiency. She crushed her valerian sprigs instead of cutting them, altered the stirring rotation to counter the clockwise friction of the cauldron, and lowered the heat precisely 3 degrees before adding the mistletoe berries. Professor Not swooped down upon her desk, a vicious sneer ready on his lips. "Let us see what a girl raised by muggles considers a potion." He stopped dead. Inside Hermione's cauldron was a potion of absolute, flawless perfection. It was completely translucent, perfectly still, and emitted no steam whatsoever, the exact hallmark of a masterfully brewed draught of forgetfulness. It was a potion a 7th year would struggle to produce. Not stared at the cauldron, his jaw tight. He looked up at Hermione, who met his gaze with a cold, knowing stare that made the adult wizard involuntarily take a step back. 5 points to Horned Serpent. Not ground out through his teeth, spinning away to retreat to his desk. Draco watched the exchange, his mind spiraling into an existential crisis. Hermione wasn't just better than him. She was operating on a level of magic he couldn't even comprehend. If she had been raised by muggles, completely devoid of magical tutoring until a month ago, how is this possible? Everything his father had told him was a lie. Purity of blood meant nothing if this girl could effortlessly eclipse the heir of Malfoy in every single discipline. For the first time in his pampered, sheltered life, Draco Malfoy was well and truly terrified. While the other first years spent their evenings in the common room playing Exploding Snap and gossiping, Hermione spent her nights in the Academy's vast, multi-level library. The restricted section was housed in the subterranean levels, cordoned off by heavy iron gates and warding spells designed to repel students without a professor's signature. Hermione stood before the gate at midnight, the library entirely empty save for the ghosts drifting through the upper stacks. She did not have a signature. She didn't need one. She pressed the obsidian stone of her heir ring against the cold iron of the gate. "I am Hermione Jean Black," she whispered to the ancient enchantments. "The blood of the founders recognizes the blood of the sacred 28. Yield." The wards shimmered, analyzing the magical signature of the ring. With a heavy, metallic groan, the iron gate swung open. Hermione slipped into the darkness, lighting her wand with a silent, wandless lumos. The air down here was thick with dust, the smell of decaying parchment, and the metallic tang of dark magic. She ignored the grimoires of blood magic and the chained books that screamed when approached. She was looking for something far more dangerous than dark arts, political history. She found the administrative archives, decades of sealed board of governor minutes, faculty financial records, and ministry correspondence. Hermione commandeered a massive oak table in the center of the gloom. Over the next 3 weeks, she sacrificed sleep, living on caffeine potions she brewed herself to construct a massive, invisible web of connections. She cross-referenced Lucius Malfoy's donations to the Academy with the voting records of the Magical Congress. She tracked the appointments of ministry judges. And, most importantly, she looked for anomalies surrounding the date of her father's conviction 11 years ago. It was tedious, mind-numbing work, but Hermione's intellect was perfectly suited for it. She possessed an eidetic memory. Once she read a ledger, the numbers were permanently burned into her mind. At 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, she found the smoking gun. It was an obscure transfer of funds from a dummy corporation owned by the Malfoy estate. The galleons had been transferred into a private Gringotts vault exactly 3 days before Sirius Black was sentenced to maximum security without a trial. Hermione traced the vault number through the school's payroll records. The vault belonged to Professor Corvus Knott. Knott had been the ministry's key expert witness during the closed-door hearings, testifying that the spell damage at the crime scene matched Sirius Black's wand signature. Lucius Malfoy had bought his testimony, and Knott had used the blood money to secure his prestigious, highly paid position at the Academy. Hermione leaned back in her chair, the blue light of her wand illuminating the cold satisfaction in her eyes. Knott was the weak link. Knott was the thread she would pull to unravel Lucius Malfoy's entire empire. But before she could move against a professor, she needed to solidify her absolute authority among the student body. She needed to ensure that no one, absolutely no one, would dare interfere with her plans. She needed to make a very public example of someone. Sterling Yaxley was a 7th-year horned serpent. He was built like a brick wall, possessed the intellect of a blunt instrument, and was slavishly devoted to the pureblood supremacy doctrine championed by the Malfoys. Lucius Malfoy had sent an owl to Draco, demanding he deal with the Black anomaly. Draco, paralyzed by fear, had outsourced the job to Yaxley. The instructions were simple. Corner the girl, humiliate her, break her wand if possible, and remind her that a Muggle upbringing made her weak, regardless of her name. Hermione knew it was coming. She had calculated the probability of a physical retaliation at 94.7%. It happened on a Friday afternoon, in a deserted, narrow corridor leading from the dungeons. Hermione was walking alone, carrying a stack of heavy ancient runes texts. Yaxley stepped out from behind a tapestry, blocking her path. 2 of his massive, equally dim-witted friends blocked the corridor behind her. Well, Yaxley sneered, cracking his knuckles. The little heiress all by herself. You know, Black, you've been causing a lot of disruption. Disrespecting your betters. Acting like you own the place. Hermione stopped. She did not drop her books. She did not reach for her wand. She looked at Yaxley with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a particularly ugly insect. You are obstructing my path, Yaxley, Hermione said calmly. Move. Or what? Yaxley laughed, drawing his wand and pointing it directly at her chest. You going to cast a little first-year hex on me? I'm going to teach you a lesson about respect, mudblood lover. He opened his mouth to cast a stinging hex. Hermione did not move a muscle, but her voice sliced through the corridor like a sharpened blade. Hermione Jean Black, heiress of the most ancient and noble house of Black, formally invoke the Lex Talionis Pureblood Edict of 1734. The words echoed with unnatural volume. Yaxley hesitated, confusion flashing across his thuggish features. The archaic law was not taught in modern magical history. An unprovoked magical assault by a subordinate bloodline upon an heir of the Sacred 28, without the formal declaration of a duel or the presence of a second, is an act of blood treason, Hermione recited flawlessly, her eyes locking onto Yaxley's. She raised her right hand, pointing the obsidian ring directly at him. By the ancient laws your own family helped ratify, Yaxley, I demand submission. The magic of the air ring flared, recognizing the invocation of the ancient blood pact. A visible, crackling whip of dark silver energy shot from the ring, wrapping instantly around Yaxley's chest. Yaxley gasped, dropping his wand as the magical binds restricted his lungs. He tried to fight it, his sheer physical strength useless against centuries-old, binding contract magic. The silver energy forced him forward, driving him brutally to his knees on the cold stone floor, right at Hermione's feet. His two friends backed away in absolute terror, pressing themselves against the walls, unwilling to draw their wands and risk the same fate. Hermione stepped forward, looking down at the seventh-year boy struggling to breathe at her feet. She leaned in close, her voice a chilling whisper, meant only for him. "You and your friends fancy yourselves apex predators because of your blood," she said softly. "But you forgot how this hierarchy truly works. The Malfoys are politicians. The Blacks are conquerors. Tell your master that if he ever sends a dog to bite me again, I will not just bind it. I will put it down." She snapped her fingers. The silver binds evaporated. Yaxley collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, shaking uncontrollably. Hermione stepped delicately over his prone body and continued down the corridor, adjusting her grip on her heavy textbooks. By dinner time, the story had spread to every corner of the academy. No hexes were cast. No blood was drawn. But Hermione Black had brought a seventh-year enforcer to his knees using nothing but her intellect and the sheer weight of her bloodline. As Hermione ate her dinner that night, Draco Malfoy sat across from her, staring firmly at his plate, absolutely terrified to make a sound. The first phase was complete. The academy belonged to her. Now, she would turn her sights on the professor who had destroyed her family. The winter descended upon the Berkshire Mountains with a brutal, biting cold, burying the East Coast Magical Academy under several feet of pristine white snow. Inside the Horned Serpent Common Room, a massive hearth blazed with emerald flames, casting long, dancing shadows across the leather armchairs and polished mahogany tables. Draco Malfoy sat near the fire, isolated from his usual sycophants. His pale hands trembled slightly as he held a letter written on heavy, cream-colored parchment bearing the Malfoy crest. It had arrived that morning via his father's massive eagle owl, and the words practically burned themselves into his retinas. "Draco, reports have reached New York that you are allowing a Muggle-raised whelp to make a mockery of our family name. I do not care what ring she wears or what delusions of grandeur she harbors. The House of Black is dead, and this girl is nothing more than an aberration. You are a Malfoy. You are the apex of magical society. I expect you to remind her of her place, expose her as a fraud, break her spirit. If you cannot manage a simple first-year girl, I will begin to question if you are truly fit to inherit my legacy.
Do not fail me, LM.
Draco crumpled the parchment, his stomach twisting into a sickening knot. His father did not understand. Lucius was sitting safely in his penthouse on the Upper East Side, relying on outdated prejudices and arrogance. He had not seen Hermione Black effortlessly dominate seventh-year enforcers. He had not felt the suffocating, ancient magic that radiated from her very skin. Draco was caught in an impossible vice. If he disobeyed his father, he risked losing his inheritance, his status, and his family's respect. But if he moved against Hermione Black, he knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that she would destroy him. She did not play by the rules of schoolyard bullying. She operated on a level of psychological and magical warfare that Draco was entirely unequipped to handle. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sterling Yaxley gasping for breath on the floor, brought to his knees by a single, archaic command. He tossed the crumpled letter into the emerald flames and watched it burn.
He needed a way out.
He needed a plan that would satisfy his father without putting himself in the crosshairs of the Black Heiress. But as he watched the parchment turn to ash, a cold realization settled over him. In a war between his father and Hermione Black, Draco was nothing more than a disposable pawn. The opportunity for Draco to act, or rather, the illusion of acting, presented itself during a double block of potions. Professor Corvus was unusually on edge, his sallow skin paler than normal, pacing the dungeon aisles like a caged animal. He had assigned the first years the creation of a swelling solution, a volatile mixture that required absolute precision. Draco had a vial of powdered pufferfish eyes hidden in his robe pocket. Added at the wrong moment, the powder would cause a localized, violent explosion, ruining the potion and likely taking off the brewer's eyebrows. It was a crude, petty sabotage, but it was all Draco could muster. He waited until Hermione was focused on slicing her bat spleens. With a shaking hand, he uncorked the vial, leaning slightly over the aisle to casually drop the powder into her simmering cauldron. He didn't even see her move. 1 second his hand was extending, and the next, a grip like cold iron clamped around his wrist. Hermione hadn't even looked up from her cutting board. She held his wrist suspended directly over the bubbling blue liquid, her fingers digging painfully into his pulse point. "Pufferfish eyes," Hermione noted casually, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the dungeon hum perfectly. A highly reactive alkaloid when introduced to bat spleen base. The resulting thermal expansion would have coated my robes in a boiling, acidic slime. Draco swallowed hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tried to pull his arm back, but her grip was unnatural. "Let go of me, Black," he hissed, glancing nervously at Professor Knott, who was pointedly looking the other way. Hermione finally turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto his. There was no anger in her gaze, only calculation. "Your father ordered you to do this," she stated, not a question but a fact. "He is panicked. He knows I am looking into his affairs, and he is applying pressure on his only heir to eliminate the threat." Draco's eyes widened. "Do not insult my intelligence by lying, Draco," she interrupted softly. She tightened her grip, just enough to make him wince. "You are presented with a logical fallacy. You fear your father's wrath, but you also fear my retaliation. You know I am vastly superior to you in every metric. So, I will offer you a third option, an exit strategy." "What are you talking about?" Draco whispered, sweat beading on his forehead. "You are going to become my informant," Hermione said smoothly, finally releasing his wrist. She seamlessly went back to slicing her ingredients. "You will write to your father and tell him you are subtly sabotaging my social standing. You will feed him whatever lies keep him placated. In return, you will forward me copies of every letter he sends you. You will provide me with his schedule, his contacts, and his weaknesses." Draco stared at her, horrified. "That's treason against my own house. If he finds out, he'll disown me." "If you refuse me, I will not just disown you," Hermione replied, her voice dropping to a terrifying, deadpan calm. "I will systematically dismantle your entire future. I will use the Black fortune to buy the debts of the Malfoy estate. I will expose your father's bribes, seize your assets, and ensure that by the time you graduate, the name Malfoy is synonymous with squalor. Or, you can work for me, and when I inevitably burn his empire to the ground, I will ensure you are spared from the ashes." She picked up her silver stirring rod and tapped it against the rim of her cauldron. "You have until midnight to pledge your allegiance, Heir Malfoy. Make the smart choice." Hermione had the financial records proving Professor Knott had accepted a massive bribe from Lucius Malfoy just days before Sirius Black was thrown into a maximum security cell without a trial. But bribery was not enough to overturn a decade-old conviction. She needed the physical mechanism of the frame-up. She needed to know exactly what Knott was paid to do. For that, she needed eyes that had seen the unrecorded history of the magical world. At 1 a.m. on a Friday, Hermione stood in the Academy's grand portrait gallery. The long corridor was lined with oil paintings of past headmasters, forgotten ministers of magic, and ancient pureblood aristocrats. Most were sleeping, snoring softly in their gilded frames. Hermione stopped before a massive, dusty painting of an intimidating wizard with a severe, aristocratic face and a silver beard. Phineas Nigellus Black, once a headmaster and a direct ancestor of her bloodline. "Wake up," Hermione commanded, her voice sharp. The portrait stirred. Phineas opened one eye, sneering down at the 11-year-old girl. "Impertinent child. Do you know who you are speaking to?" "I am Hermione Jean Black, heiress presumptive," she replied, raising her right hand to display the obsidian ring. "And I am speaking to a portrait that is bound by blood and magic to serve the reigning heir of our house. Sit up, Phineas. We have work to do." Phineas's eyes snapped to the ring. His demeanor shifted instantly from irritation to a solemn, grudging respect. He bowed his head.
Heiress.
It has been a long time since that ring was worn. How may I serve the house? 11 years ago, Sirius Black was framed for murder, Hermione stated. The trial was sealed. The evidence was classified. But I know Corvus Knott was involved. Portraits see everything, Phineas. They hear every whisper in the ministry and the academy. I need to know what Knott did. Phineas stroked his painted beard, a dark smirk playing on his lips. The Knott boy. A coward, always creeping through the shadows. I do know what he did, Heiress. I was hanging in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement's evidence lockup when it happened. Hermione's heart gave a single, hard thump, but her face remained impassive. Tell me. The magical signature, Phineas said, his painted voice echoing in the quiet corridor. The spell that killed those muggles was traced back to Sirius's wand. But Sirius did not cast it. Corvus Knott snuck into the evidence room 3 days before the hearing. He used an illegal, highly restricted spell, the Echoing Curse. It allows a wizard to imprint the magical signature of one wand onto the residual spell damage of another. Hermione's mind raced, perfectly cataloging the information. Knott forged the ballistic evidence. Exactly, Phineas nodded. He cast the spell, took the bribe from Malfoy, and testified as an expert witness that the signature was a perfect match. But the Echoing Curse leaves a microscopic, dark residue on the wand that cast it. Knott's wand. Hermione smiled, a cold, predatory expression. If the DMLE were to examine Knott's wand today, would the residue still be there? Magic leaves traces, Heiress, Phineas said ominously. Dark magic leaves scars.
Yes.
The proof is in the very what he carries. Hermione turned on her heel. She had the motive. She had the financial trail. She had the weapon. Now, she just needed the perfect stage to execute her trap. The Academy's Winter Gala was an annual tradition designed ostensibly to celebrate the end of the fall term, but in reality, it was a networking event for the East Coast's magical elite. The Great Hall had been transformed into a winter wonderland, complete with floating ice sculptures, enchanted snow falling softly from the ceiling, and a 12-piece magical orchestra playing sweeping waltzes. The Board of Governors, prominent politicians, and wealthy alumni were all in attendance, mingling with the professors and upper-year students. Hermione did not arrive with the other first years. She arrived late, ensuring a maximum tactical entrance. When the heavy oak doors opened, conversation in the immediate vicinity died. Hermione stood at the top of the grand staircase. She was not dressed like an 11-year-old schoolgirl attending a dance. She wore custom-tailored, formal dress robes of midnight black acromantula silk, trimmed in silver. The Black family crest was embroidered over her heart. She looked like a miniature queen preparing for a funeral. She descended the stairs with measured, deliberate grace. The crowd parted for her. She ignored the stares, the whispers, and the blatant pointing. Her eyes were locked on a tall, imposing wizard standing near the champagne fountain. He had long, pale blonde hair tied back in a velvet ribbon, and he carried a silver-headed walking stick. Lucius Malfoy. Hermione walked directly toward him. Beside Lucius stood a terrified Draco, who went rigid as a board the moment he saw her approaching. Mr. Malfoy, Hermione said, her voice perfectly polite, but carrying a distinct chill. Lucius turned, looking down his nose at her. His eyes flicked to the air ring on her finger, and a microscopic muscle in his jaw twitched.
Ah.
The much-discussed Miss Granger. Or should I say Miss Black? I must admit, I am surprised the goblins allowed a Muggle-raised child to claim such a heavy mantle. The magic of my ancestors recognizes competence, Mr. Malfoy, Hermione replied smoothly, stopping just out of arm's reach. It tends to reject cowards and sycophants. It is why the Black fortune dwarfs the Malfoy estate by a factor of 3. Lucius's eyes flashed with genuine anger, his hand tightening around his walking stick. You have a sharp tongue for a child.
You would do well to learn respect.
The wizarding world is dangerous for those who do not understand the political currents. Oh, I understand the currents perfectly, Hermione smiled, leaning in just a fraction. I also understand banking. For instance, I found it fascinating how dummy corporations can be used to funnel large sums of galleons. Specifically, transfers made exactly 11 years ago into the vaults of certain potions professors. Lucius froze. The aristocratic mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing stark, unfiltered panic. Draco, standing beside them, looked as though he might be sick. I don't know what you are implying, little girl, Lucius said, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. I am implying nothing, Hermione said brightly, stepping back. I am merely stating facts. Enjoy the gala, Mr. Malfoy. And tell Professor not to take good care of his wand. It would be a shame if the DMLE were to accidentally examine it. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. She had planted the seed of paranoia. Lucius would panic, and he would pressure not. And when cornered rats panicked, they made fatal mistakes. Corvus Not was officially a broken man. Following the winter gala, Lucius Malfoy had cornered him in his office, threatening to ruin his life, throw him into Azkaban, and butcher his reputation if he did not silence the black girl immediately. Not, fueled by cheap fire whiskey and blind terror, decided to bypass subtlety. It was 3 days after the gala. Hermione was returning from a late-night study session in the library. She walked through a long, isolated corridor in the West Wing, an area currently closed for renovations. It was dimly lit by flickering torches, and the stone walls were lined with antique, enchanted suits of armor. Hermione's sharp ears caught the sound of metal scraping against stone.
She stopped.
The silence stretched. Then, from the shadows at the far end of the corridor, a heavy, rhythmic clanking began. 3 massive suits of medieval armor stepped off their pedestals. Their visors were snapped shut, their iron gauntlets gripping massive broadswords. Their eye slits glowed with an eerie, violent red magic. Behind them, standing in the shadows, was Professor Knott, his wand raised. You brought this on yourself, you arrogant little brat, Knott hissed, his voice trembling with manic desperation. A tragic accident. A student wandering where she shouldn't be. The armor's defensive enchantments malfunctioned. That's what the Heiress will say. He slashed his wand downward. Kill her. The 3 suits of armor charged. They were heavy, incredibly fast, and swung their broadswords with enough force to cleave stone. Hermione did not run. She did not scream. A terrifying sense of absolute calm washed over her. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She drew her wand, planting her feet firmly on the stone floor. As the first suit of armor swung its massive blade directly at her head, Hermione didn't bother with standard disarming charms or stunning spells. She tapped into the dark, ancestral magic residing in the ring on her finger. Confringo Maxima, she roared. But it was not a standard blasting curse. Fueled by the Black family magic, the spell erupted from her wand not as a bolt of red light, but as a dense, concussive wave of sheer gravitational force. The spell slammed into the lead suit of armor. The impact sounded like a bomb detonating inside a cathedral. The armor did not just break, it crumpled inward, the thick iron folding like tin foil under immense pressure, before exploding backward into a shower of shrapnel. The shockwave knocked the other 2 suits off their feet, sending them crashing into the stone walls. Hermione strode forward through the smoke and raining metal, her eyes burning with lethal intent. She pointed her wand at the remaining 2 armors as they struggled to rise. Reducto. The twin blasts shattered the armors into thousands of unrecognizable pieces. The corridor fell dead silent, save for the ringing in their ears and the clattering of scattered iron. Professor Knott stood frozen at the end of the hall, his wand dropping from his trembling hand. He stared at the 11-year-old girl walking toward him through the wreckage, her wand glowing with lethal, residual heat. You thought I was a defenseless child, Hermione said, her voice echoing coldly in the ruined corridor. You thought you were hunting a Muggle-born. She stopped 3 feet away from him, leveling her wand directly between his eyes. Knott fell to his knees, openly weeping in terror. Checkmate, Professor, Hermione whispered. Now we're going to my office. And you are going to write a very detailed confession. The dungeons of the East Coast Magical Academy were usually silent after curfew, but tonight, the heavy oak door of Professor Corvus, Knott's private office, slammed shut with the finality of a crypt. Hermione flicked her wand, and the deadbolt slid into place with a series of sharp, metallic cracks. She applied a silencing ward to the room before turning to the man weeping on the floor. Knott had collapsed near his mahogany desk, his hands shaking so violently he could barely push himself up. A knock sounded at the door, 3 rapid taps, a pause, then one more. Hermione lowered the wards just enough to let the door swing open. Draco Malfoy slipped inside, his face as pale as moonlight, his breathing shallow. He stopped dead when he saw his head of house, a man he had been raised to respect, groveling at the feet of an 11-year-old girl. "You're late, Draco," Hermione said coldly, not taking her eyes off Knott. "I had to bypass the prefects," Draco stammered, staring at the shattered remains of Knott's pride. What happened in the corridor?" Professor Knott experienced a sudden crisis of conscience, Hermione replied smoothly. She stepped forward, the heel of her leather boot clicking sharply against the stone floor. She pointed her wand at Knott's chest. "Get up. Sit in the chair." Knott scrambled into his leather desk chair, wiping frantically at his face. "You don't understand, Black. Lucius would have killed me. He would have ruined me if I didn't stop you." "Lucius Malfoy is a politician, Corvus," Hermione said, rounding the desk to stand directly beside him. "I am the heiress of the noble house of Black. You chose the wrong monster to fear." She gestured to Draco, who was standing frozen by the door. "Draco, fetch the ledger from the bottom left drawer. The one warded with blood magic." Knott gasped. "How do you know about?" "I know everything," Hermione interrupted flawlessly. "Draco, the drawer."
Now.
Draco hurried forward, pulling out a heavy, iron-bound ledger. Because it was warded against thieves, it hissed and sparked when he touched it. Hermione casually placed her hand over it, letting the obsidian ring pulse with ancestral magic, instantly breaking the lesser blood ward. She opened the book. Pages upon pages of illicit transfers, blackmail material, and bribes. And there, perfectly documented, was the deposit from the Malfoy Dummy Corporation exactly 3 days before Sirius Black's conviction. A physical paper trail, Hermione tooted, shaking her head. Arrogant and sloppy. "Now, Professor, place your wand on the desk." Knott hesitated, his fingers twitching. "Do it, or I will remove your arm from the socket," she promised. He placed the dark elm wand onto the polished wood. Hermione picked it up carefully, with a silk handkerchief. "This wand contains the chronomantic residue of the echoing curse you cast 11 years ago in the DMLE evidence lockup. Between this and the ledger, I have the weapon, the motive, and the financial transaction. All I need now is the confession." She summoned a quill and a roll of magical parchment. She slapped them down in front of Knott. "Write," she commanded. "Every detail, every bribe, the exact phrasing of Lucius Malfoy's orders. And if you attempt to lie, the parchment will burn the skin from your hands. Begin." Under the terrifying gaze of the Black Heiress and the horrified watch of the Malfoy heir, the corrupt professor began to sign his own ruin. Hermione did not take the confession to the headmaster. She sat alone in her dorm room at 3 a.m., the fire burned down to glowing embers. Headmasters cared about the reputation of their academies. They would attempt to handle the matter internally, perhaps forcing Knott to quietly resign to avoid a scandal. Hermione had no interest in avoiding a scandal. She wanted a public execution. She carefully duplicated the ledger pages and the confession using an advanced transcription spell she had practiced for weeks. She placed the original ledger, Knott's wand, and his signed, magically binding confession into an enchanted, unbreakable lockbox secured with her magical signature. Then she drafted 2 letters. The first was addressed to the director of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement at MACUSA headquarters in New York. "Director, enclosed you will find evidence of severe corruption within your department, dating back 11 years, specifically regarding the sealed trial of Lord Sirius Black. You will find a signed confession, financial records of bribery, and the wand used to forge ballistic evidence. I formally request an immediate aura strike team be dispatched to the East Coast Magical Academy to apprehend Corvus not for perjury, treason, and the illegal use of the echoing curse. If you attempt to bury this, refer to the second package I have sent tonight. Hermione Jean Black, Heiress presumptive. The second letter was attached to a copy of the evidence and addressed to the editor-in-chief of the New York Magical Chronicle, the most widely read and ruthless newspaper in the American wizarding world. She walked up to the school's orrery as the sun began to peek over the Berkshire Mountains, casting a blood-red glow across the snow. She selected the 2 fastest, most vicious-looking eagles she could find. She tied the packages to their talons and watched them disappear into the freezing morning sky. The trap was set. All that remained was for the jaws to snap shut. Breakfast in the Great Hall was a boisterous affair. Hundreds of students were eating, laughing, and ignoring the biting cold outside. Professor Knott was sitting at the high table, looking like a corpse. His eyes were sunken, his skin sallow, and he violently flinched every time a fork clattered against a plate. Hermione sat at the horned serpent table, calmly buttering a piece of toast, an open book on advanced magical theory resting beside her plate. Draco sat directly across from her, his food untouched, his eyes darting nervously toward the entrance. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the morning mail arrived. A flurry of owls swooped down from the rafters, dropping the New York Magical Chronicle onto the tables. The Great Hall erupted. Students gasped, pointing at the front page. Professors stood up from their chairs, their faces turning chalk white. The headline, printed in massive, bold, moving ink, screamed, "Corruption at the Academy? Professor not implicated in decade-old Black frame-up. Lucius Malfoy named as financier." Draco choked on his pumpkin juice. He stared at the headline, then slowly raised his eyes to look at Hermione. She hadn't even looked up from her book. She simply turned a page, took a delicate bite of her toast, and smiled. Before the chaos could fully take hold, the massive oak doors of the Great Hall blew open with a deafening crash. 10 Makusa Aurors marched into the room, their wands drawn, their crimson trench coats billowing behind them. They moved with terrifying military precision, completely ignoring the screaming students and the outraged headmaster. They marched straight to the high table. "Corvus not," the lead Auror barked, his voice magically amplified. "By the authority of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, you are under arrest for perjury, evidence tampering, and high treason against the Magical Congress." Knott didn't even try to run. He slumped forward, knocking his goblet over, sobbing openly as 2 Aurors hauled him out of his chair and bound his hands with glowing suppression cuffs. "I was forced," Knott screamed hysterically as they dragged him around the table. "Lucius Malfoy made me do it. He threatened my life. You have to protect me." The entire Great Hall watched in stunned, absolute silence as a professor was dragged out of the room like a common criminal. The Aurors hauled him down the center aisle. As they passed the horned serpent table, Knott's wild, desperate eyes locked onto Hermione. She finally looked up from her book. She offered him a small, polite nod, the kind one gives to an acquaintance on the street. When the door slammed shut behind the Aurors, the silence held for 5 more seconds before the hall exploded into pandemonium. Everyone was shouting. The professors were frantically trying to restore order. Draco leaned across the table, his voice a frantic whisper. "You actually did it. You destroyed him. My father, he's in the paper. The ministry is going to investigate him." "Your father's political armor is thick, Draco," Hermione replied calmly, closing her book. "He will deny everything. He will claim Knott is a madman and that the dummy corporation was managed without his knowledge. He won't go to prison today." "Then what was the point of all this?" Draco asked, genuinely terrified of her intellect. Hermione's dark eyes locked onto his, cold and calculating. "Because I just proved to the entire world that Lucius Malfoy bleeds. I took away his proxy inside the school. I destroyed his reputation. And most importantly, I forced the ministry to formally reopen my father's case. This was never about destroying Lucius Malfoy today. This was about clearing the board, so I can destroy him tomorrow." The spring term arrived, washing away the snow and replacing it with blooming greenery across the academy grounds. The school, however, was fundamentally changed. The arrest of Professor Nott had sent shockwaves through the elite pureblood families. The power dynamic within the Horned Serpent House had violently shifted. Sterling Yaxley and his cronies kept their heads down, terrified to even make eye contact with Hermione. Draco Malfoy, though outwardly maintaining his aristocratic sneer, was entirely subservient to her behind closed doors. But ruling through fear was inefficient. Hermione knew that true power required loyalty, not just terror. In late May, she requisitioned an abandoned, sunlit classroom in the East Wing. She had the dusty desks removed and replaced with plush armchairs, massive oak tables, and imported magical chalkboards. It looked less like a classroom and more like a high-end political war room. She invited exactly 12 students. They were carefully selected, for were brilliant Muggle-borns who had been marginalized by the Academy's elitist culture. 4 were half-bloods with exceptional academic records. And 4 were purebloods, like Draco, who possessed influence but were trapped by their parents' archaic ideologies. When they were all seated, looking around nervously, Hermione stood at the front of the room. "You are here because you represent the top 1% of intellect and capability in this school," Hermione began, her voice commanding yet remarkably inclusive. "For centuries, magical society has been dictated by blood. It is a scientifically flawed, entirely inefficient system designed to keep power in the hands of aging, paranoid men." She paced across the front of the room, her eyes meeting each of theirs. "The Muggle-borns in this room have been told they are less than, despite outscoring the purebloods in every practical exam. The purebloods in this room," she glanced at Draco, "have been told they must carry the burden of bigotry, simply because their fathers demand it. I am offering an alternative." She waved her wand, and the chalkboards behind her lit up with complex diagrams of magical law, economic structures, and proposed societal reforms. "This is the Black Study Group," Hermione declared. "Here, blood purity is irrelevant. The only currency that matters is merit, loyalty, and brilliance. I possess the wealth and the political immunity of the House of Black. I will fund your research, I will protect you from the old guard, and I will ensure that when we graduate, we do not just enter magical society, we run it." A Muggle-born girl in the second row slowly raised her hand. "What do you want in return, Sirius Black?" Hermione smiled, a genuine, albeit sharp, expression. "I want your absolute best. And when the time comes to dismantle the corrupt establishment that currently rules our world, I want you standing by my side." By the time the meeting ended, she had secured 12 fiercely loyal acolytes. She was not just tearing down Lucius Malfoy's network, she was actively building an intellectual mafia to replace it. The platform at Grand Central Terminal was sweltering in the late June heat as the Atlantic Express hissed to a halt, billowing white steam across the stone floor. Hermione stepped off the train, her heavy trunk trailing obediently behind her. She did not look like the scared girl who had boarded the train 9 months ago. She stood taller, her posture immaculate, the heavy obsidian ring gleaming on her finger. Through the crowd of reuniting families, she spotted them. Richard and Jean Granger. They looked anxious, standing near a limestone pillar, entirely out of place among the robed wizards. Hermione's cold, aristocratic mask melted away. For a brief moment, she was just an 11-year-old girl again. She dropped her trunk and ran to them, throwing her arms around her mother's waist. "Oh, sweetheart," Jean cried, holding her tight, burying her face in Hermione's hair. "We missed you so much. Are you okay? Were they horrible to you?" "I'm perfectly fine, Mom," Hermione said, pulling back with a soft, reassuring smile. "It was a very productive year." Richard ruffled her hair, looking at her with a mixture of overwhelming love and a deep, underlying respect. "Ready to go home to Boston, kiddo?" "Yes," Hermione nodded. As they walked toward the Muggle exit, seamlessly blending back into the bustling New York crowd, Hermione's mind was already 1,000 miles away, orchestrating her next moves. 300 miles away, Perched on the balcony railing of a lavish penthouse overlooking Central Park, a massive black raven landed with a heavy thud. It tapped its beak aggressively against the glass door until a house elf opened it, letting the bird inside. Lucius Malfoy sat in his study, a glass of expensive fire whiskey in his hand, his face lined with stress. The investigation into Nott's confession had cost him millions in bribes to keep his own name out of the Ministry's crosshairs. He was exhausted. The raven dropped a single piece of heavy, black parchment onto his desk and flew back out the window. Lucius hesitated, then unrolled the parchment. There was no greeting. There was only one sentence, written in elegant, emerald green ink. "I know what you did. I am coming for you." Lucius crumpled the parchment, his hand shaking so violently he nearly dropped his glass. The game was no longer being played in the shadows. Further north, on a desolate, jagged rock in the middle of the freezing Atlantic Ocean, the imposing fortress of Azkaban's American equivalent, Blackgate Penitentiary, stood against the crashing waves. In the highest, darkest cell, a man sat huddled in the corner. His hair was matted, his clothes were rags, and his skin was pulled tight over his bones. Sirius Black had spent 11 years clinging to his sanity, surviving the soul-crushing despair by knowing he was innocent. A tiny, spectral glow appeared between the iron bars of his window. It was not a Dementor nor a guard. It was a minuscule, folded paper bird, charmed to bypass the prison's dark wards. It fluttered down into the cell and landed in the dirt near Sirius's bare feet. He stared at it for a long time, terrified it was a hallucination. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he reached out and picked it up. He unfolded it. The paper was perfectly clean, smelling faintly of old books and expensive ink. Written in the center, in handwriting he did not recognize but felt deeply, inherently connected to, were 5 words. "The House of Black stands." Sirius stared at the words. He read them again, and again, until the ink blurred. For the first time in over a decade, hot, heavy tears spilled over his sunken cheeks, tracing paths through the grime on his face. He pulled the piece of paper to his chest, holding it over his heart. He threw his head back against the damp stone wall, and for the first time since the night he was arrested, Sirius Black smiled. The heiress had awakened, and hell was coming for the people who had wronged them. And that wraps up Hermione Black's ruthless first year. Now, I need your help to shape what happens next. For year 2, should Draco fully defect and become Hermione's loyal spy, or should he attempt a dangerous double-cross to win back his father's approval? Drop a spy or double-cross in the comments below to decide his fate. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. See you in the shadows.